hey, hopefully you'll be able to enjoy some fan art before we get into the main topic of the video. But today, we've got to ask ourselves a question. When we are upgrading the mana bases in our decks, let's say we've bought a precon for the first time and we're just trying to get rid of some of those tapped lands that come into it, what's the main thing we have to focus on? Well, there's two things. One, if a tapped land is in your deck, the tapped land needs to be doing a lot of work to justify being a tapped land. And if a land can come to play untapped, then we want that land to be able to tap for as many types of mana as possible. This is why things like Command Tower are great, Exotic Orchard are great, Forbidden Orchard are great. These are all decent budget options that everybody has access to for land pips. And typically with dual lands, we have a lot of options in terms of untapped lands. But let's say you've already watched my other land guides and you're wondering to yourself, is there a situation where I would want a mono-colored tapped land? And I don't mean stuff like Bojuka Bog. Like, obviously, Bojuka Bog is a wonderful land, and I don't know why I keep hearing people cutting it out of their decks. Graveyard removal is a very important thing that people need to have access to, and a lot of people don't like putting it in their 99. But I'm here to bang the drum of MDFCs. Now, MDFCs, or Modal Dual-Faced cards, are cards like this Hagra Mauling here. It looks like a 4-mana removal spell. It's a bad version of Murder, but if you flip it, it's a land on the other side. Now, why would you want to use one of these? What would be the purpose of including these in your land base? Well, put it simply, they are free. Now, what I mean by that is if you have a deck with, say, 37 lands, count every MDFC as somewhere between half a land and a full land. So if you've got a 37 land goal for your deck, then putting 39 lands in and 4 of them being MDFCs will give you about what you want in terms of what your deck is doing. Now, the reason I say they're free is they are spells that occupy your land slot. This means that when we're looking to slot our deck out to make sure that it has the adequate amount of removal, the adequate amount of draw power, the adequate amount of, fetching and recursion, we're trying to make sure our deck can do all these things. Often MDFCs can help us get there while just being free, because they just exist in our mana base. These are basically free slots. And while there are situations where your MDFC is not going to get you its spell ability because you have to play it as a land, there are options to make sure that even that can be taken care of. If you play a bounce land like a Boros Garrison or a Simic Growth Chamber, it can be very easy to justify starting out a game by dropping an MDFC on the board. Let's say I'm playing a Sultai deck and I've got a Simic Growth Chamber and a Hagra Mauling in hand. I know that I need to drop the Hagra Mauling early and then bounce it to my hand with the Growth Chamber, and now I've still got the Hagra Mauling in my hand as a removal spell. The only thing I've truly given up, outside of the speed of playing a couple tapped lands, is the information that I have a removal spell in my hand. But even that information can be a bargaining piece with our opponents. Like, hey, I didn't have to play my removal spell as a removal spell. I had to play it as a land. Everybody feels like they can breathe a little easier because there's one less removal spell in the pile in everybody's hands. Now I have the removal spell in my hand. That can be an interesting political piece. Obviously, you can just reveal cards to your opponent at any point, but doing it with game mechanics is way more interesting to me. So today, we're going to talk about some MDFCs that you should be running and why, and the niches that each of these fill in a deck. That way you can have a decent starter primer for how to use these cards when they are applicable and why you should. Now, again, count these as anywhere between half a land and a full land in your mana base, depending on what your deck's mana curve is. You can count them as a whole land if your deck's mana curve is super, super low, and count them as half a land if your deck's mana curve is super, super high. Basically, if your deck has a mana curve of like 3.5 or higher, count these as half a land, because you need your lands to be more efficient in decks that have higher costs for things. Also, note, MDFCs will raise the mana curve of your deck because by their very nature, they tend to be overcosted for what they do. The benefit you get from them is that they are modal. They can either be a land on the back or a spell on the front. That's why they're called modal dual-faced cards. That's what MDFC stands for. So, obviously, we're here with Hogger Mauling. Might as well start with this one. It's our free removal spell that you get access to. It's not free. It can cost 3, but almost always it will cost 4. Costs 1 less if your opponent has no basic lands. That typically doesn't happen. This is just a removal spell we have access to. In black, we also have Zoth Consumption. This is a 6 mana card that makes everybody lose 4 life, and you gain 4 life. I like this card in decks like Dina Soul Steeper that want it as a quick finisher or a starter to some type of Sanguine Bond shenanigans. It is very overcosted for what it does, so you should never feel bad about dropping it on its land backside that comes into play tapped, but because it happens to be a card that can ping everybody for 4 and give you 4 life, it's a mini Gary in that respect, it is a card that can get you out of the jaws of defeat, or can make sure that everybody is just a little lower on the scale so Dina can Death of 1,000 Cuts them in the end. Oftentimes when you're playing Aristocrats, people are just a couple damage points away from game. Cards like Zoth Consumption, being able to just bounce them to our hand with any of the various ways we have to bounce lands to our hand, like bounce lands, for instance. This card ends up making the cut in a few of my decks because it fills that role. Also, Pelika Predation is a wonderful card. Typically, I do not like Thoughtseize type effects in my Commander games because Thoughtseize type effects, they don't really work that well in Commander because you're spending a card to get rid of a card in somebody's hand. They may or may not have anything necessarily great. But if it's a card like Pelika Predation, I actually like it more because this is a card that gets to not only hit an opponent after they've drawn a significant amount of cards, or make sure that if they've tutored something to their hand, we can just snipe it out of their hand early. This card also, because it is a land on the backside, means that if we do not find ourselves in a table with a lot of tutors, we can just drop it as a land and it's no longer a dead or middling card in our hand. Unlike a card like Thoughtseize, which while it has a better cost at 1, cards like Pelika Predation can just be a land when we need them to. Then we have cards like Malakir Rebirth. Now, this is the weakest type of Reanimator effect we have in Magic the Gathering. Cards like Malakir Rebirth make sure that if a creature dies, we can get it back on the board, and it costs us 2 life when we do it. That's generally not a super strong effect. I only like this kind of feigned death effect in decks that really like sacrificing their stuff a bunch, but I will make exceptions for Malakir Rebirth because this card can be used in any black deck as 1 more reanimation spell you have access to while being a land on the backside. It never hurts to drop a Malakir Mire on its backside because it's the weakest kind of reanimator effect, and by having access to it in our hands, it's a great way to protect commanders and anything else. Worried about a board wipe? Malakir Rebirth. Have a good sack engine? Malakir Rebirth. Speaking of reanimation effects, we have a stronger one in Agadeem's Awakening. Now, Agadeem's Awakening costs 3 black mana and X to return any creatures from our graveyard who have different converted mana costs within the scope of the X or less that we pay. This is usually a haymaker finisher for reanimation decks or even aristocrat decks that want to be like, I'm going to get my Blood Pet or my Viscera Seer, and then I'm going to get my Zulaport Cutthroat, then I'm going to get my Marauding Blight Priest, and you get the idea. You get all of your cards all the way up to Gary, drop them on the board, and then proceed to do aristocrat nonsense to kill people. But one of the great benefits of Agadeem's is that unlike the other MDFCs, it can actually become an untapped land if you pay 3. That's right, mono-colored shock lands. I adore Agadeem the Undercrypt because I can play it early, use it to drop out a mana rock or 2, and then bounce it to my hand with a Golgari Rot Farm. I've never really felt bad about dropping this on the board because you either have it as a land early or as a spell super late game. If you have it in your opening hand, you never are really happy to see it. You'd rather drop it on the board and pray to bounce it to your hand later. With a mana cost this high, that's generally what you're going to see. And that does it for the black cards that I would use in most of my decks. So let's move on to the other side of Rakdos, our red cards, beginning with Song Mad Treachery. Now, this card has a couple of niche situations that I like it in. Any deck that's win condition requires stealing our opponent's cards. I have an Ink Treader Nephilim where I run this, where you cast the Song Mad Treachery on the Ink Treader Nephilim, and then it gains control of all of your opponent's creatures at the same time. I like this card in decks like that, but it is overcosted for what it does, which is why it's good that it's a land on the backside, which can help us a ton in getting to our ideal mana base. Then we have a card called Shatterskull Smashing. This is another one of your shock land type cards, but it deals X damage divided as you choose to up to 2 target creatures or planeswalkers, but if X is 6 or more, deal twice that much damage. This is basically a removal spell you have access to in that slot, which is fantastic. Then we have Valakut Awakening. It can flip to a tapped land. And it's a wheel. Put any number of target cards from your hand to the bottom of your library, then draw that many +1. Wheel effects are not exactly draw effects, but they do help us get rid of dead cards in our hand to make sure that we have lots of extra things going forward. So it's great for that. Then we have Kazel's Fury. This will be the last red card we talk about. As an additional cost to cast it, sack a creature. Deal damage equal to that creature's power to any target. I adore fling effects like this in any deck, like say you're playing a Magus Lucia Kane deck. The deck wants to get out gigantic creatures, and whether or not it swings with them is up to the mercy of the gods. But with Kazel's Fury, you don't have to make those kind of decisions. Just take a giant Hydra and chuck it at their face. Also, as with all the MDFCs, it is a land on the backside, which makes it fantastic at its job. But then we want to move on to the white cards, and this is one of my favorite cards in all of Magic the Gathering, and I put it in so many decks. I love Ondu Inversion. This is a board wipe that blows up all non-land permanents because y'all fuckers don't know how to kill enchantments, apparently. And Ondu Inversion, like all of these, flips on its backside into a land. I adore effects like this because it is just a no muss, no fuss, blow up everything, and I get to add 1 extra board wipe to my deck when I include this because it's in my land slot and I don't have to count it towards anything. Not really. Then we have Kabira Takedown as another removal spell. It lets you hit a creature for damage equal to the number of creatures you control, which is fantastic. In go-wide decks that already want to have a lot of mana because things like Martial Coup exist, this is a wonderful removal spell to have just in that slot. Then you have McKinney Stampede. In go-wide decks, again, this is great. It is a very quick overrun effect minus the trample, but plus the ability to be a land. I love McKinney Stampede in decks that want to go wide, and I think it should be ran in more go-wide decks because it's an MDFC. It's free. Yeah, it's free real estate. Just cast the card. It's fine. Then we have Sajiri Shelter. Is a 2-mana card that gives any creature protection from 1 color of your choice until end of turn. Again, I run this in decks like Ink Treader Nephilim, any Voltron-y style decks that rely on having a single creature that gets to survive multiple turns. This is great for any effect like Blacksmith Skill, Tameo Safekeeping that can make sure that one of our commanders can survive copious amounts of bullshit is great, especially when the card was a free include because it is a land on the backside. And then we have Amiria's Call. Now, this one used to see a lot of standard play. It was a very, very powerful standard card, but it's still got some uses here. Because it is a untapped, shocked white land, we can use it in any deck that cares about angels as a way to bolster our effect, bolster. Those are the words I'm trying to say. Bolster our board in the late game when we are worried about, say, several flying creatures coming at us. A Voltron has wings, or there's a dragon player on the board. Amiria's Call is a good way to buff up our board in the end game while being a land in the early game. It is very, very good at what it does, even though what it does is very, very niche. But that leads us into green with the non-tapped shocked green land Turn Timber Symbiosis. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. Play any creature from it for free. That's it. That's it. There's other text on it that if the creature costs 3 or less, you can put 3/1/1 counters on it, but really it's just It's just a way to play a card for free off the top of our deck. If we're paying 7 mana, play this, and I don't know, cast an Eldrazi off the top or something. Card's gonna do you a solid when you play it. I adore Turntable Symbiosis in big mana decks, but the next card we got to talk about is one you probably already have in your deck right now. At least, I hope so. It's Bala Ged Recovery. Return any card from your graveyard to your hand. It's a regrowth, but stapled to the back of a land. That's fantastic. And I don't know how to tell you that recursion is good. But there's another one that does something very, very interesting. And as a green enjoyer, Tangled Flowahedron definitely sits high on my list of usable cards, because Tangled Flowahedron is a mana dork or a land. This is a card that gets to act as part of our mana curve or a ramp piece, depending on what we need. And since having access to mana is literally green's thing, this is one of my favorite mana dorks in the game. And then we have Kalani Ambush. One of the best ways green has to kill things is with fight spells, and Kalani Ambush is a fight spell stapled onto the back of a land, which is fantastic. And I shouldn't have to explain that it is great. But speaking of things that colors are known for doing, blue is known for countering spells. And this is where Jwari Disruption comes in. Now, Jwari Disruption, the best thing about it, obviously, is that it is a land on the backside, but Disruption is good in very, very simple metas. So, let's say you are playing in a meta that has fewer interaction pieces than they need. Typically, in these lower interaction metas, this card tends to shine, because usually players play cards on curve. When people are responsible and run interaction, they tend to keep up a little bit of mana at the end of their turn to make sure that nobody can staple them in the face with a haymaker. Jwari Disruption punishes players who do not engage in this playstyle. Players who are known for spending all of their mana on their turn to get the biggest, beefiest, bestest boy out as best as possible always lose to basic counterspells like this that can just say, hey, pay 1 for that or you lose it. Oh, you don't have the 1 because you just dumped all of your mana into a giant haymaker Hydra? Oh boy, I wonder what that means. So, otherwise it's a 2-mana counterspell that gets to be a land. Because it is this, you know when you sit down at a table at your local shop whether or not the card will be applicable in the game you're in. If you are playing with people who you know deck build in a way that allows them to interact, drop the card on the board as a land. Perfectly reasonable play. If you know you're playing with a whole bunch of people who have Timmy mentality and want to get big Colossal Dreadmaws out on the board on curve, then this is the card to punish them for that playstyle. And then we have Selendi Vision, a wonderful pair to the Jwari Disruption, an instant cast card that lets you look at the top 6 cards of your library and take an instant or sorcery from them and put it into your hand. This card is wonderful in any Storm deck, any Spellslinger deck, any control deck that just needs to get a specific type of card so that it can survive a haymaker coming from your opponents. Selendi Vision, of course, as with all these, is a land on the backside. But the most important thing about it is its utility. The fact that if I'm holding up enough mana, I can Selendi Vision into a counter spell or a removal spell, like a Generous Gift, and just ping somebody's combo that they're trying to go off with at instant speed will always be incredibly helpful to me. I adored Selendi Vision when I played a lot of Veyron. It's a good card, and I would highly suggest playing it. But there is one card that I play in almost any deck I can shove it in, and that's Glasspool Mimic. So this card, as with everything we've talked about, is a land on its backside, but the biggest thing about Glasspool Mimic is that it happens to be a clone. And unlike everything else I've talked about, Glasspool Mimic actually happens to be on curve. So the best no-nonsense clones cost 2 and 3 mana. Strangely enough, Glasspool Mimic costs 3 mana. It costs exactly what we would expect a good clone to cost, while also being a land. This is one of those weird times where, like, technically Wizards got something in their cycle wrong, But I'm not going to complain that they got it wrong, because having access to a clone is always good. Even in decks that normally wouldn't run clones, Glasspool Mimic does a ton of work. But that leads us to the last card we got to talk about today. This is a big one that was ran in Standard for a little bit. This is Seagate Restoration. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. And then you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. And luckily, it can flip into a shockable, non-tapped blue land. This is 100% a free card in any deck you can shove it in, and the only reason I don't play it in every deck I have that has blue is because the card costs $30. And the card should not cost $30. But it does cost $30. So that creates a bit of a problem. And I know you're looking at the version I have on here and you see this lovely little date stamp on it and you're like, hey, it's not a $30 card. You're showing a more expensive version of the card. You're right. Hold on. Okay. There's the basic version. I shaved a whole 30 cents off of it. Wizards of the Coast, please reprint these. For some reason, Wizards doesn't really like printing MDFCs in pre-con product, but I really think that MDFCs would be really good to print in pre-con product. But we've only gotten two pre-cons so far that had MDFCs, so I guess we're not going to be getting that anytime soon. But that was my list for MDFCs you should be running in your decks. Modal dual-face cards are fantastic. They give you a ton of utility in a slot that you were already running, and I don't know how else to bang the drum that when you're playing on a budget or you're playing at at tables that have people who are willing to do more than just durdle on their turns battlecruiser style, having cards that do more work in slots you already need to begin with is incredibly helpful. A lot of these I actually run in my strongest decks. Hagramalling, Ondu Inversion, Glasspool Mimic, and Malakir Rebirth are all staples of my Sephiroth deck because they are, again, free cards that just do what the deck wants to do. It wants to control the board. It wants to clone. It wants to reanimate. So I have lands that do all that too. And if the cards have to come down as not spells, that's fine. It's better to be able to play cards on curve than not be able to play cards at all and just have them in your hand and stare at them because they're nice and shiny. Nice and shiny cards are better when you can cast them, and you can cast more cards if you play more lands. And it's easy to play more lands if you make your spells lands. But with all that said, thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Apologies for some of the bits where I was unable to speak for a second. That was me muting the mic and coughing, because I'm still sick, despite feeling like I was fine when I woke up today. So I wanted to talk about these guys and get the last bit of my land guide stuff done so I can move on to other parts of the Getting Better at Magic section. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If there are any MDFCs that I missed that you think deserve a slot here, let me know so I can add them to the Master Lands Guide. And the Master Lands Guide, as always, will be located in the description of this video, because you should be running better lands in your deck. Please, these are all wonderful lands. Run them. They are, it's a no-brainer. They are lands on the backside. Please, I beg of you. It's not difficult to make a case to run lands that do extra things. Bye. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability a Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.